Okay, thank you very much. So I'm really pleased to welcome our first keynote speaker for today. Dr. Renny Thomas is a social anthropologist specialising in science and religion, social justice and knowledge and biographies of sciences in post-colonial India. He's an assistant professor of sociology and social anthropology at the Department for Humanities and Social Science at the Indian Institute of Science, Education and Research. And he's been the Giles Wallace Fellow in Social Anthropology at Queen's University Belfast and a visiting fellow at the Department for Cultural Anthropology and Cultural History at the Friedrich Schiller University in Germany. Thomas is the author of Science and Religion in India Beyond Disenchantment, and that's the book he's going to kind of draw some of his talk from today, which looks and co-editor for mapping scientific method disciplinary narrations, and he's currently finishing a co-edited volume titled Decolonial Keywords, South Asian Thoughts and Attitudes, and working on another co-edited volume on technology and religion. And he's also, if that wasn't all enough, an associate editor of SAGE, the Journal of Social Studies of Science. So with all of that going on, Renny, we're really grateful that you could take the time out to join us today. And so I will hand over to you. Thank you ever so much.
Thank you, Finlay. It's really, great to speak actually for the forum. I mean, I could see many people that I read, and I'm so happy to see Professor Hitley and various others. Now, what I'm going to do in this talk is to really look at what happened in the field of science and religion, especially coming from the discipline that I am. Social anthropology, and within specifically science and technology studies. Now, there are certain, of late I have been reading a very interesting book, actually, edited by, Marina Perez Sheldon and Ahmad Raga. It's a very, very interesting book, and it's very crucial for something that I'm going to speak as well. It's titled Critical Approaches to Science and Religion. Just came out, I guess, this year. This year from Columbia University Press. Now, this book actually, of course, I'm still reading, just talking from the introduction, very interestingly argues the necessity to talk about some categories that we haven't really explored in the fields of science and religion. And specifically, they are talking about questions around race, science, and religion. So questions around race, gender, sexuality, etc. But in my work, the fact that I work in India, there are certain other specific questions that I was interested in while looking at the debates on science and religion. And I'll come to that very soon, specifically about the question of caste, science, and religion. And before that, just to begin the conversation, within the field of science and technology studies and anthropology of religion, there was for a long time certain form of avoidance of actually looking at questions around religion, because there was always this idea that STS is essentially about looking at the internal of science. But while doing, laboratory ethnography in India, Indian institutions, but I'm sure this is the case also in other locations. There are very interesting ethnographies now from the United States and various other laboratories where they talk about the presence of religion, or what they call as this presence of supernatural in scientific laboratories in many ways. So I was, while doing my work in the laboratories in India, I was quite fascinated by the way the scientists actually, live with their religious life without necessarily compromising, their science. And, I did fieldwork in one of the very, very prestigious scientific institution. They have produced very important scientists, including in the 1930s Nobel laureate in physics, C.V. Raman. So, we are talking about elite scientific institutions where they're actually producing what we call as good science, and they were also good believers in many ways. So as an anthropologist, I was very much interested in understanding this phenomenon. And while, doing ethnographic research in the scientific laboratories, one key question that came to my mind, and then that shaped many of my, work and arguments later, which is about the significance of actually studying what we call as non-sites of religion, sites that are not necessarily, connected to religion, and the significance of looking at non-sites of religion in understanding religion, right? Such as of scientific laboratories, the so-called secular institutions, which is again a very interesting category that we see that in the various contexts, secular in many ways actually means the dominant religion actually. So it is not different also in the case of India. Now, my conversation scientist, it was for almost for a year. I was part of a laboratory, talking to my laboratory friends. After a point of time, I became, in many ways, an insider, but not, a complete insider, right? It's kind of a near insider. Like I'm not a scientist, but then they knew that I'm doing some kind of a research. So they were very happy to talk to me, etc. But they knew that I'm doing something else. So, often when we have a coffee conversation, they would ask me, but then what exactly are you studying? Like, because you are asking about our religious life. Very often this question comes to you, what about you? What is your background, right? And, as a good, objective anthropologist, you don't want to discuss actually about your own background. So, but, say there is a certain sense of scientific objectivity that exists. So therefore, I'm here to really understand you and your culture and your religious beliefs, etc. Now, it's interesting over a period of time, I have realized while talking to the scientists, they come with really, really interesting arguments about the way they believe. Now, of course, I'm not going to talk about everything that I have discussed in the book, which has 5 chapters that I very specifically discuss, actually, specific nature of religiosity among scientists. But, a group of scientists really attracted me. And that's really then very interesting to also look at the genealogy of modernity, science, and religion, which is a group of scientists that I spoke to argued that they are believers. There is no doubt that they don't believe in God or deity, but they are not like others, right? So we don't believe like the layman, for example, right? So these scientists really gave a lot of reasons to argue that our belief is very distinct from the non-scientists. So the distinction that they make in the laboratory, in the scientific institution, is very interesting, actually crucial in many ways to understand the very nature of modernity. And it's very important to also note that many of the scientists that I have, spoke with, interviewed, have had their initial training in natural sciences and physical sciences from leading universities from Northern America and United UK. Right, that's also very interesting. Like how they shape their idea of belief. Now, this particular scientist that I'm going to talk about, he's a biologist, a very, very interesting biologist. His name is, I call him actually, I call at this, for this moment, for the discussion, I call him Siddhartha. Okay, so I'll just read some ethnography if you need to open up the debate. A PhD student of Siddhartha, who is a geneticist, entered his office to get few documents signed when we were having a conversation. He introduced me to his PhD student and said that the student is going to submit his PhD. This is very soon. I wished him well. Once the student left the room, he continued, and I quote him, "There is a difference between scientists and the general public." He was referring to the difference between scientists as believers and the lay believers. And I make this distinction of scientists as believers and lay believers in the book. Siddhartha was actually not the only scientist who made this distinction. Scientists I've met and interviewed subscribe to this distinction. The separation of scientists as believers and lay believers is made to construct a distinct religious identity, and using that identity, they claim a superior religious status, that they are distinctly religious, or rather scientifically religious. When they constructed a distinct religious identity, they also made sure to state that they admire the ancient Indian culture and contributions to science. Now, this particular, the figure of Siddhartha is very significant in understanding the ways in which how, science was used and religion was used, and how there was a conversation between the categories of science and religion within the scientific laboratories. Now, when Siddhartha and various other scientists argued that they believe very distinctly, that they believe very, scientifically, they're also trying to actually make the claim that what they believe has certain form of scientific basis, right? In many ways, it contributes to the debates on scientification of religion. Because they are scientists, they are believers with certain sense of scientific attitude, scientific temper, etc., right? Now, I was very much interested in, as an anthropologist, as an ethnographer, in understanding why do people make this, claim that I'm a believer, yet I'm very different from the lay believer, the layman, right? Now, this led me to really look at various other questions, which is not necessarily ethnographic, but then this ethnographic observation really helps us in understand the larger questions around how, people make really these claims. And these claims very often come from, sorry, these claims very often come from the cultural and religious background that they are from, right? So in this specific context of India and Indian institutions, it's very significant to understand when people use the word that they're believers, they're obviously talking about the fact that they believe in a Hindu God and deity, because for various historical and sociological reasons, the majority of the scientists are actually from one religion in most of the institutions, including the institute that they have studied. So the idea of belief, the idea of religion that they are talking about is very clearly from their own belief as Hindus, their upbringing as Hindus, right? Which is very important actually to, for my next argument. Now, if this is how Siddhartha has argued his belief and kind of claimed this distinct religious identity to exist among the laymen, that yes, I am also a believer, but I am not like you, then we will also see later how this distinction is made between the Hindus and the non-Hindus in different ways, in the sense that when this identity that, the religion that we believe in, the religion that we have is a scientific religion, is therefore in opposition to religions that are always in conflict with science, right? So very clearly, I call it actually a strategic coexistence of science and religion, which very often actually in my field and then also various other studies now demonstrates that helps in certain forms of cultural nationalistic understanding of, religion and science. This coexistence is very often used for various political causes in that sense, right? That a particular religion is closer to science, it's naturally connected to religion, naturally connected to science, etc., right? Now, this argument is also coming because of the kind of scholarship that exists actually in the history of religion, especially the kind of scholarship that is coming from South Asia, specifically India. Now, starting from colonial times, whenever scholars have looked at, questions around religion, questions around science, it was mostly actually not religion and science actually, but it is Hinduism and science, right? But this idea of religion was used to kind of homogenize everything, right? So therefore, the colonial construction of India, which many post-colonial scholars have tried to really dismantle, is that when we think about India and when we think about religion, it's not always about Hinduism and religion, Hinduism and science, right? There exist other religions. What about, for example, Islam and science? What about Sikhism and science? What about Buddhism and science? What about Christianity and science, etc., etc.? So this sense of plurality is so significant in understanding questions around religion and science in the South Asian context, actually, right? Now, this is, of course, and I see that the next speaker is actually going to talk about the significance of religious diversity. And I argue that this is very significant also when we think about certain societies which are historically connected to, in the imagination, that it is connected to a particular religion, therefore has to be, debunked, dismantled, those kind of understanding. And then what is the possibility? How do we look at actually, right? There is only one way of looking at the everyday lived practices of science and religion is to by being part of the field, right? So ethnographically, one has to really enter the scientific institution. So in my work, I try to argue that these distinct religious beliefs also then helped in making certain form of superior religious beliefs among scientists. And this actually then led me to really look at the larger questions around caste and science. When we think about religion and science, that scholars have not paid attention to the role of science, the role of caste, actually, right? And so that's also one of the things that while I was reading the book, Critical Approaches to Science and Religion, there isn't much discussion actually about the questions around caste and religion. And we see that in the Indian situation from my own fieldwork, that various other scholars also, that we see that when actually when people or scientists, when they construct their identity as believers, what is important to note is that they are constructing their identity as believers of the dominant Hindu tradition, right? So the what they call the so-called upper caste beliefs and practices. It doesn't even include the beliefs and practices of the various other sections, which are called the Dalits, the ex-untouchables, the other backward castes, etc., etc. So no, of course, if one is really looking at the scientific institutions and laboratories, etc., because we don't have enough representation of these sections, it's really difficult to actually also get what they think of these questions, right? And this is where actually the necessity of talking about caste in science and religion is so significant, because then it opens up new ways of really looking at plurality of science and religion. So what I'm trying to argue is actually when we think about plurality of science and religion, or when we think about religious diversity in science and religion, we need to really also pluralize the particular religion that we are talking about, right? So which section are we talking about? Even when we think about Hinduism, like, are we talking about, the dominant or the less dominant in that sense, right? And in the context of India specifically, of course, in the discussion time, if you have more questions, we can discuss. In the context of India specifically, I argue that when we really look at, when we study the biographies of scientists in India, there is a tendency to study a few more, few famous, important scientists, right? And most of them are upper caste men, predominantly, the Brahmin scientists. And the worldview of science and religion very often then come from their worldview, and it's most often, coexistence, that we work together, right? So there is a politics of coexistence of science and religion. That's what I'm trying to argue. So I argue that we have to really then go, beyond them, to see the life of scientists from minority religions, women scientists, and scientists from the subaltern castes, and the indigenous backgrounds in India, what we call it the Adivasi, sections, right? We need to have a history of science and religion in India, informed through the lives and experiences of the non-Brahmin scientists. This will greatly enhance our understanding of both science and religion. And I argue that it's not that it is going to enhance our understanding of science and religion in India, but it is also going to actually enhance our understanding of science and religion outside the world, right? Because in a way, how do we really look at the larger questions around, connected histories of science and religion? I'm so glad that Professor Headley is here. In fact, one of his earlier articles in Sigor was really instrumental in thinking about these questions about how do we go beyond, the dominant religion. Okay, how do we go beyond the question of conflict and complementarity? Now, traditionally, if you look at literature, ethnographic research has been done among the powerless, right, and the less influential. the so-called non-moderns, and specifically that was the case in India, right? There's always this anthropological approach. In India, especially, it's very rare to find anthropological studies of powerful and influential groups such as scientists. Though it is challenging, it's important to study these scientists. Lab ethnography and studies of scientists help an anthropology to change its historical identity as an intellectual discipline engaging only with the others, primarily the so-called non-moderns. Again, we cannot really homogenize the categories of science and scientific institutions in India. Every institution has its own distinct culture, depending on location and leadership, etc. Now, when you study science and religion specifically, it's important to really study, scientists and their engagement with religion. However, it's also important to study how the general public actually understands the relationship between science and religion. This is also one of the points that I want to again stress, because when we again think about science and religion, we tend to actually read the biographies and the autobiographies of scientists and then, generalize. So even now, we don't really have enough literature to understand what the public actually think about science and religion. That becomes very crucial in the context of political, economic context of India, for example. Everyone, because, there is a thin line actually between the religious and the secular in the South Asian context. And I'm sure this is the case everywhere, but in India specifically, there's a thin line between the religious and the religious and the non-religious, or the religious and the cultural, right? So the cultural, I argue in my book as well, is always connected to the culture of the dominant religion, right? So that is, really culture. So this notion of culture then shapes also the way of doing science in India. So there are actually not much scholarly works on the public understanding of science and religion in the Indian context. This will be an important theme for anthropologists and sociologists to explore. The public understanding of science and religion, very often, it gives us the everyday meanings of science and religion. Now, in India, I argue, it's not uncommon to hear public and media discussions about the religious lives of scientists, especially when scientists openly discuss religion and prayer publicly, right? Certain kind of rituals that they publicly practice. Studying the public perception of science and religion will help us understand the ways in which ordinary citizens perceive both science and religion. Another group that anthropology should engage with is the religious priests. Again, when we think about science and religion, we don't really get to hear what the priests, whether they're temple priests or, they think about really this question. It doesn't really exist, actually. There are some recent literature coming from anthropology of religion. I'm thinking about the work of scholars like Tulsi Srinivas. So she kind of looks at how the temple priest in Bangalore deals with modern technologies, actually. For example, how do they actually use FaceTime? Like the Hindu devotees in the United States, they use actually the priests from Bangalore using FaceTime to do their rituals and, important life cycle rituals, because people can't really come here, and especially rituals related to, naming, birth, etc. So studying a priest from different religions will help us expand our understanding of science and religion. The major argument that I am trying to make in this book is that even though I have done field work in India, studied the Indian scientific laboratories and the scientists, I'm not trying to argue that it is very, something that is very specific to India, that one needs to really exoticize, actually, right? But what I'm trying to argue is that, this is something that you can find, everywhere, right? So if one does actually field work in different scientific laboratories in the US, in Europe, you'll find actually the presence of, what we call as religion. Like Natasha Mayers has this fascinating book, or I think it's called The Rendered Life, talks about questions of ethics, questions of moral in scientific laboratories. And sometimes this the question of ethics and morality very often comes from certain forms of religion. Now, therefore, I don't want to argue that, or the book is really not about, it is not an Indian case study of science, I argue, but a case study of science in the Indian context. The study of science and religion in the Indian context is meant to contribute to the study of science and religion in the international context, as the existing scholarship on science and religion mostly discuss, the Western experiences. The experiences from different parts of the world enrich the academic discussion on science and religion. Although my book is on science and religion in India, it has to be noted that the intention is neither to exoticize the Indian tradition or the situation, nor to erase the specific cultural context of science and religion in India. By studying the intermingling of science and religion in India ethnographically, I try to argue in the book that the book speaks to the complexity, the plurality, and the ambiguity of sciences and faith, no matter where we find them, and explores the cultural contexts that give rise to such complexities in plural sense. It's important, therefore, to see how these contexts mediate believers' assertions and anxieties about how their religion comports with science. In the case of India, for example, we see that such concerns is part of a Hindu majoritarian push to dominate political and civil space, right? To argue that, well, so this religion is superior in terms of dealing with questions around science, for example, right? So, for an informed anthropology, for an informed global anthropology of science and religion, the global anthropology of science and religion is actually a framework where, even though people or anthropologists and ethnographers do fieldwork in different locations, but those locations are not necessarily, about the place that they have studied, but this will then inform the larger context, the larger framework of science and religion, wherever we find them. So for an informed global anthropology of science and religion, it is necessary that we shift the focus of discussion from the West to the non-Western sites, as it enriches the discussion and gives new narratives and vocabularies to talk about science and religion. So basically what I'm trying to argue is that there are, of course, fascinating literature that we have from history of religion, history of science and religion, religious studies, theology, sociology, etc. But, I'm saying this not because I'm an anthropologist of science and ethnographer of science, but I think to understand the everyday meanings of science and religion in the non-Western context, it is important that we enter the field. And that's the only way to really look at actually the specific categories which were not visible in the textbooks of science and religion, the textbooks that even came from India, which kind of tried to, homogenized the experiences of science and religion, as if there is something called the science and the religion in India. But when we actually study, when we are actually in the field, when you study scientists who are from different religious backgrounds, one clearly observes that this homogeneity is just a myth. In that sense, when there is this larger claim that there is a coexistence of science and religion, I argue that we need to really then problematize this coexistence. And at the same time, we also have to be very careful, I'm using Peter Harrison's word here, in terms of looking at also the politics of complementarity. Right? Because this complementarity, as I have briefly discussed, I'm sorry, I couldn't really discuss in detail, but as I have briefly discussed, one could see that the idea of complementarity is again used by the dominant sections, right? The dominant religious sections to come to this argument that there exists something called a scientific religion. So in many ways, this idea of a scientific religion is nothing but a political construction. Right? And I think as scholars of science and religion, it is important that we note down these questions and think about a critical understanding and examination of science and religion. And that's possible by looking at, as I have used, but following the larger scholarship of within science and religion, which includes scholars like, Brew Headley, Peter Harrison, and various others about the problematization of binaries, of complexities, or conflict and complementarity, or dialogue, etc., etc. But to understand even the idea of dialogue, to understand even the idea of complementarity, it is important that we look at diverse populations and diverse cultures and see how they deal with this question of complexity. They deal with the question of dialogue, or they deal with the question of actually complementarity. So I think I will end there maybe. So maybe we can have I would really like to have conversations and questions because this is a very ideal site of science and religion. But thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Renny. We'll give you a bit of a virtual round of applause. It's not quite the same thing as being in the room. I'm going to throw it open to, I've got a nice batch of questions, but I will throw it open to the floor first. If anyone's got any questions, you want to put your hands up. Nathan, go for it.
I don't know if you can hear me. Hopefully you can. Oh, cool. Yeah, thanks, Renny. Hello. Good to see you. And yeah, it's really good to kind of hear your work again. Yeah, as you know, I read your book and I very much enjoyed it. So it was really good to kind of hear you talk about it more. I had I got one question. I got other questions I could ask, but maybe I'll leave it for later if there aren't any other questions. But I was just wondering in terms of on the scholarship of science and religion and caste, as you mentioned, there's not much work that's been done in it so far. So I was just wondering what work has been done on it, if any, were there any bits of work that kind of inspired you to work on your book, or help you kind of develop your ideas in this area, or is it really, the sense that there's barely anything on it and your work is like some of the first work in this area?
Yeah, I mean, thank you, Nathan. That's a great question. Now, my interest in really looking at the question of caste and religion came from one of my, initial conversation with a scientist in the field, who is from a non-Brahmin background, who is, in today's language, they're called the Dalits, actually. They're the ex-untouchables, the so-called lower caste, right? So, I was having this, I met him actually at a, study group in most of the institutions, how they study group. They're called Ambedkar, Periyar, Phule study group. I mean, these are actually three important reformers of modern India, right? Ambedkar is the one who wrote India's constitution, who was a Dalit and studied in Columbia University, so very, very significant figure. So right now what happens is a lot of students who join these scientific institutions also have these study groups in most of the institutions, right? So they talk about their own culture, but when it comes to the scientists, when it comes to the faculty level, they don't have much representations. But they do have students because of reservation, which is India's affirmative action, right? The students are from various castes are there in the institution. So this particular person was a PhD student in physics. So we were having a conversation, and then he told me actually that, the fact that you're talking to some of these scientists might not give you really the reason to study science and religion, because they would be really talking about their religion. And they said their religion is not our religion. And they said, like, for example, then I asked him, give me an example. They said, like, well, if you ask them about culture, right, they would talk about the classical Indian dance, classical Indian songs, etc. These were very clearly part of the culture of the higher upper caste, right? Then he said, like, if you ask me my culture, which is not this, right, which is folk songs, folk culture, resistance songs that are coming from the people that I have mentioned before, the anti-castes, kind of culture that they come from, right? So then I thought this is very important, because what he was trying to argue is that if you want to understand the relationship between science and religion, you need to look at the plurality within Hinduism itself. right? And that's when actually the question of caste really came to my mind as an important category to look at. And obviously, as students of sociology and anthropology, caste is everywhere, right? But there was always this idea that, it's of course a fallacious idea that, one doesn't really find, caste practices in modern scientific institutions, right? That is why, the subtitle of my book is actually Beyond Disenchantment. But disenchantment, in many ways, I'm trying to really, use Weber in different sense here. That even the scientists who claim, the casteless identities, the modern identities, still actually practice caste in their own ways in terms of basically marrying from their own caste, following the religious traditions, the caste traditions. And what's important also is to note how many of the scientists who would be otherwise called as rationalists, right? Because they claim that they are not believers actually. So I mean, that they have a chapter on atheist scientists in the book actually. So the atheist scientists, in many ways, actually, they are atheists only in a cultural sense, right? So they still practice everything that the other religious scientists do in terms of, the caste practices. But, they try to claim their atheist identity in a very different sense, right? But which is not devoid of their caste and the religion that they come from. So I argue in the book that, they are atheists in a religious way, right? So that is how actually the question of caste as a important category came to my mind while I was doing my fieldwork in the southern part of India, in Bangalore. And the place is also very important. Bangalore is seen as actually the techno city of India, right? I hope that answers your question, Nathan. Thank you.
Thanks, Nathan. I'm going to ask one of mine while others dwell on theirs. I thought what really struck me, and I'm not a scientist by training, so I might be about to say I might have all my UK scientists frown at me and say this isn't the case. But I thought it was really interesting that you said that the scientists that had a faith felt they had like a stronger faith than or a superior faith than the kind of the non-scientist. That's not something I've personally come across in what I've read, but like I say, I'm not a scientist and I've not worked in a lab or done any research in a lab. I just wondered if you could kind of expand on that, on maybe if they shared some of their rationale of why was their faith superior, or was it actually just intrinsically tied into caste rather than the faith and the science relationship?
Yeah, again, a very interesting question, actually, right? Now, of course, when the scientists actually argue that, or when they try to really formulate their, superior religious identity, which is different from the layperson's religious identity, and they give some examples from their life. Okay, I'll give you one example. So this particular person, he told me once, while we were having a coffee at the canteen there, he said, listen, if you look at the lay persons, right, there's a famous temple in South called the Tirupati temple, which is a very famous Hindu temple. Now, if you look at the lay persons, they all go and be in queue for, hours and hours to just see the sanctum sanctorum. And then he said, as a good scientist, I go to the temple and I come back. I am not going to be in the queue and to see the sanctum sanctorum. It doesn't matter because the God knows that I came here. And I don't need to see the figure of the God, but that's for the non-scientists because they need to see, because that's an unreasonable from his point of view. Okay, so in the sense that then he would argue, well, also the fact that for me, the idea of going to a temple is less to do with, believing in that God, but it is more of, enjoying the architecture. Right? Certain form of religious architecture. I really enjoy that architecture. Now, then he says, it's because I'm a scientist that I actually even think about these questions. Right? The lay scientists, the lay persons don't really think about questions around aesthetics, questions around architecture, etc., etc. They come there to pray and go back, but we are different. And there are various examples one can give. Now, these are the ways in which actually they construct, a very distinct religious identity. And the distinction, I argue, that they make for various reasons. First, of course, to make the fact that we are different from the non-scientists. Second is actually the very history of post-colonial science in India kind of gave this credibility to scientists as the experts. Right, it is closely connected to the notion of nation building, because since the beginning of, since 1947, most of the important scientists were very much part of actually the government, right? They enjoyed this notion that they are experts. Now, it is also by claiming this identity that we are experts and we are different from the others, and they need to claim a religious identity. And this is very important if you actually look at some biographies and autobiographies biographies of leading scientists of post-colonial India. They try to assert this identity that we believe, but we are very different from the non-believers. And I argue that there is certain kind of pressure that the scientists have to prove their expertise, that we are different, and to claim basically to get this, legitimacy among the public. And this is also one of the reasons I argue when, the media reports every year, whenever there is a important, rocket launching happens, Indian Space Research Organization, that the scientists actually take the replica, right, to the temple and pray. And it's, of course, it gets reported in all the newspapers, and the media and the public all basically discuss this in quite in detail. Now, this also comes because generally people think that scientists shouldn't be doing this. Right. So you can understand why then they construct this separate identity, that we are different. And in fact, even the space scientists who do this, if you ask them, they will have their own reason. They say, no, but it's really nothing to do with science actually, right? Because we are going there because it is a cultural tradition which is part of the institute, that we are continuing that. Actually, this really has nothing to do with, the science that we do, the space science that we do. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Renny. Luca and then Matthews.
Yeah, I just have a question. I've been watching the movie where they describe the life of the Indian mathematician. I hope to pronounce this correctly. So I was, so essentially, he was a mathematician that ended up in Cambridge, and they discover. He helped to discover many theories of mathematics, and he was very appreciated. But what I was interested, I would like if you can comment. There was something in his religion that he kind of knew the mathematical truths already in his mind before he discovered, and he couldn't articulate them. And I think it's very resonant with some of the things you say with your work, at least. So I don't know if you want to say something. I was fascinated by that, and I guess it's something very Indian, but I still need to grapple with it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about this fascinating figure called Ramanujan, who was a student of Hardy in Cambridge. Wonderful person. There are a lot of interesting writings on that. Actually, I'm thinking about this very interesting work by an Indian psychoanalyst called Ashish Nandi. And he has written this book, Alternative Sciences. So in this book, Alternative Sciences, he compares the life of Ramanujan and another Indian scientist, actually, because the other person also believed that the plants actually have life. Okay, so Ashish Nandi is trying to really understand how these two scientists construct a different form of science. So when we think about Ramanujan, when he was asked, I think Hardy and various other Cambridge mathematicians have asked him, how did you get the solution? And he said that, I don't know. And he said actually that the goddess of Namakkal, which is a local deity actually from his town, that she came to my dream. And actually that is how I know. I have no idea otherwise. I really can't give, a reasonable answer. This is what he said. And I came to know this solution through a goddess. And he believed till his death. I mean, of course, he died very young, actually. He died, I think, in his mid-30s, actually, while he was in Cambridge. So, that's again a very important, argument, right? Because I mean, it's not actually, see, if you look at some other important figures, like, you have Ramanujan, but also if you think about another person called E.C. George Sudarshan, a physicist, a very important physicist who was nominated for the Nobel in two or three times in physics, was a professor at Texas Austin. And he also argued in the similar manner, so there is certain, when it comes to explanation, there is certain sense of, supernatural, as we call it, comes to their explanation. So I don't really know whether it is really coming from the fact that because they are from a particular region, or it is because of the discipline that they are in. I really don't know, actually, because this is also the case in a few American scientists, right? Some of them have also argued in similar manner. So I don't know if one can actually look for a certain sense of, specific nature of belief, or is it about, the discipline that they are in? Of course, in the case of Ramanujan, he is not a trained mathematician at all. He was an accountant, actually. And similarly, C.D. Raman, actually, right? I mean, he was also an accountant when in the initial phase of his career. So I don't really have an answer, like, why he had that answer, whether the dream was true, etc. But this film is a fantastic film. I also enjoyed it. It's a fascinating film. Dev Patel has acted as Ramanujan.
Thank you. But it reminds me of some kind of Platonic idea that are already existing, and then the mathematician discovered them. It's like...
Yeah. But, another way of really answering this question is to also look at how certain communities' connection with disciplines, right? And because, Ramanujan was a Brahmin, and some communities actually were specializing in certain disciplines in different ways, right? Mathematics, because many of the Brahmins were also accountants, actually, right? And they were employed by the British in the beginning, right? So most of the accountants in the British time were Tamil Brahmins, and Ramanujan is a Tamil Brahmin, actually, right? So I don't think then, therefore, his own father was in the profession as well, not a mathematician, but very much doing this kind of, the work with numbers, actually, right? So maybe that's one way of looking at, actually, right? What is the connection with the certain kind of work instead of disciplines, maybe. I don't know. I mean, I really don't have an answer, but.
Thank you, Renny. Matthews, you're next, and then John, it's you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Renny Thomas, for your presentation, especially your works that are still in process. Thank you for your perspectives. My question was more in terms of the methodology. But you have unearthed the link and the fluidity between science and religion, and how, unlike in Europe or Euro-American settings, science and religion does not have such a clear dichotomy in terms of the approach. So you have unearthed that from India. So how does that methodologically impact the whole business of science and religion? Because now that you have unearthed maybe in a way collusion, or even fluidity in terms of not exactly being binaries, how does that affect the very questions that are asked in science and religion in the West, for example, in UK or the US? Because there are questions of power, there's questions of coloniality even. The whole enterprise of science and development in science, could that be attributed to some form of privileges that have been functioning, making science what it is today? So that's my first question. Secondly, the other way around, particularly from a Christian theology point of view, in India, I had the privilege of citing you in my first chapter of my thesis on science and religion in my MTH thesis in UTC Bangalore. If we were to draw a timeline, there are stalwarts like Paulos Mar Gregorios of the Orthodox Syrian Church, who was involved in as early as 1970s, organizing conferences in MIT regarding genetics and biological engineering, etc. what kind of impact could that happen? Could science and religion have on Indian traditional churches, which are deeply entrenched in the Indian reality, which to an extent, even in the churches, there's an element of casteism. But would you have something to say on the impact of science and religion on traditional churches in India, which seem to be blissfully, maybe not necessarily finding science and religion conversation so important as today? And where I come from in Kerala, most of the students are preferring it's either medicine or engineering. And there is that kind of a connection because it brings in returns, and it's seen as sign of upward social mobility, and it's seen as a sign of intelligence. So, but that's not been addressed from a science and religion point of view. What are your thoughts on that? Thank you very much.
Thank you. I mean, these are, wonderful questions. So the first question is, of course, very important. I guess this also, spaces like this actually, should really think about, which is that, one of the problems when we read actually the literature on science and religion, like, when I was reading literature on science and religion, which actually, important scholars, like, of course, John Hedley and various others had argued that, first of all, we need to really free, the debate on science and religion from what they call as, the Protestant provincialism, right? So this has been addressed in various scholarship actually on science and religion. So I'm specifically thinking about the work of Sujit Sivasundaram, who is a Sri Lankan scholar based in Cambridge University. And he has this wonderful article, which was part of one of the, the earlier texts on science and religion in the handbook. I think this was edited by Hedley Brooke and really forgetting the other co-editor, but I need to check. But where he tries to argue that, we need to really look at sciences and religions beyond the, the Protestant settings, right? So because most of the scholarship that was even coming from the Europe was informed through these debates, basically, right? Now, of late, of course, there are other important works as well. So I'm thinking about scholars like Banu Subramaniam, and she has this very, very important work called The Holy Science, the Biopolitics of Hindu Nationalism. And, there are various other scholars where they try to argue that when we think about questions around science and religion, it is important that we think about the plurality. Plurality in the sense that on the one hand, we need to look at the multiple genealogies of these categories. That's where it's important that, we shouldn't be exoticizing, which was always the case, and especially coming from Indological kind of tradition, that there's a tendency to exoticize everything that is Indian. And on the other hand, it is also important to look at the forms of rationalism and rationalist thought that existed in the classical Indian tradition, etc., etc. Now, we need to really open up methodologically the field of science and religion, also to the field of classics in many ways, right? Because these are the same texts that was used in many ways to, exoticize various traditions. Okay, now in that sense, religion is, or the field of science and religion is a successful endeavor in interdisciplinary research, because, we have scholars coming from anthropology, history, philosophy, religious studies, theology, and they're all asking this question, right? Beyond, what is expected, right? One is not always looking for, okay, whether there is a, natural coexistence, whether there is a natural kind of, coming together, coexistence, right? But how that actually works in the field. And in the field, when I mean, I'm not necessarily talking about the ethnographic anthropological field, but I'm also talking about the archives. And that's why where, historians like Peter Harrison has, looked at, the reason why one needs to really problematize the usage of not just science, but also, religion, right? That both of these categories of science and religion are new constructs. As Peter Harrison would argue that science is, of course, a 19th century and religion is maybe 17th century, right? Because then he tries to argue that how natural philosophy is not necessarily science of today. Natural theology is not necessarily religion of today. I think methodologically what is important is to really have more interdisciplinary approach where historians, anthropologists of science also looking at the archival debate. So for example, in my work, what I did, of course, I did field work, but I wanted to also understand, especially there is this whole debate on, what we call as the alternative sciences, right? Whether it is Ayurveda, Unani, homeopathy, etc., etc. So I was very keen because when I speak to scientists, they have this interesting argument that, well, there exist other forms of sciences, but they are not necessarily sciences, etc., right? And I was very much interested in actually going to the archives. And now the reason I wanted to go to the archives is for a different reason, because the question around scientific timber, that we all need to have scientific timber, was also under attack, right? Many ways, from political society, political organizations. I wanted to understand how all this actually had begun. So I went to the archives, started looking at the personal papers of Nehru, the first Prime Minister of India, and the ways in which he looked at questions around science and religion, questions around, indigenous medicine, etc. And it's just fantastic because Nehru, who was again from Cambridge, he did natural sciences tripos from Cambridge, came back to India, completely influenced by people like various important scientists of England at that time, that he was trying to really argue that there is only one way. That way is actually science. And that language is scientific method. So in the parliamentary debates, when people asked him questions around, the reason why the state is not necessarily funding Ayurvedic institutions and other medical institutions, he only had one answer. And that answer is really fascinating, actually, if you look at it. He says, that's because these systems don't follow scientific method. And he says, if any of these systems, if they need the support of the state, they need to actually use scientific method. So I went to the archives, came back to the field again and see how there is a, conversation that was happening from the historical time to the contemporary times. So I think it is so important that we, combine these methods in the field of science and religion. And that's obviously the case of most of the interdisciplinary fields. And science and religion is also not really free from it. So this is the answer that I have, like briefly. And the second question, what was the second question? Sorry.
It was about from science to church. Like, what do you think?
Yes, that's an extremely important question. In fact, something in one of the footnotes in my book, I argue, and I think sometimes, we give footnotes because well, there is a larger politics of what can be discussed also in the text, right? So if you look at the debates on science and religion in India, of course, since 1970s, we have academic debates. And some, one could think of a few sociological debates from 1970s about science and religion, few historical debates also. But what is interesting, which many of the scholars who looked at these debates did not pay much attention, is about this particular place, which I gave a footnote in the last chapter. That the case of the Jesuits in India, okay, and especially the Institute of Science and Religion in Pune. Right, they have an institute. It's one of the oldest institutions where they discuss about questions around science and religion, mostly theologians. So there are some historians sometimes, they address. Like in this footnote, I argue that, for instance, the historian of science, Dhruv Rena, briefly discusses the ways in which the Jesuit priests and theologians in Pune try to engage with the question of science and religion through their publications, teaching, conferences, and outreach programs. So the Pune Institute actually does a lot of workshops on science and religion, which is actually open to everyone. So a lot of students go, like not just students of theology, but also students of literature, sciences and all, they go to attend these debates on science and religion. But this did not get much attention actually from scholarship on science and religion. And this is what I was trying to argue before, that it's equally important to look at what the priests really think about these questions. And this is where, the questions about, how the indigenous churches and because that would be very fascinating to look at. I have not really looked at what about the indigenous seminaries in Kerala, for example, because they all have a course on science and religion, if I'm not wrong, right? So what do they teach? How do they teach? And it's very interesting because, if I'm not wrong, I think they also try to really combine the question of science and religion with comparative religion, right? Because I don't think they just talk about, science and Christianity, but they also talk about other religion, which includes Hinduism and Islam, maybe this again, I don't know, because these are things that I hear from people, etc. Because I have not done really fieldwork among the priests. But one thing I am very sure, because I have looked at some of the syllabus, that they do teach, right? Courses on Hinduism, comparative religion, etc. in Christian seminaries in Kerala, for example. So that will be, I think, an interesting point to really look at. Can one think about question of science and religion differently in these places, maybe?
Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you, Renny. John, you're next.
Yeah.
Hello, Renny. It's great to hear you talking about your book, which I think, has opened up the importance of asking these further refined questions, which differentiate groups of people. And even part of the message you put across this morning, which clearly has affected us, is the way you stress the way that the scientists who men of faith did regard themselves as, in some sense, superior. They belonged almost to a special class. And this is the question Finlay was rather struck by too, I think. Just a point about that in relation to the history of European science, because that was raised a moment ago. That sense of the natural philosopher or the natural scientist being somehow a privileged member of society. For Robert Boyle, that was very crucial. He felt that as a Christian and as a scientist, he was a privileged member of society. He did enjoy a certain kind of superiority. And the reason for Boyle was that studying nature experimentally, as he did, it brought you face to face with some of the wonderful aspects of creation, which you would not experience if you didn't have that scientific learning and scientific practice. And a second example would be somebody like Isaac Newton, who felt he belonged to a very small, privileged group who, in a way, in his view, were the true Christians, those who denied, for example, the doctrine of the Trinity, because he thought the early Christian church had actually got things wrong and made the wrong decision about the status of Christ. Now, the particular question I want to ask in the light of this, if you look at the history within Christianity of these kind of superiority claims, you become aware that very often they led to the scientific figure concerned experiencing some kind of censorship from the more orthodox religious authorities. And I just wanted to ask you whether there is an equivalent of that within the Indian cases that you have looked at. Do these scientists who regard themselves as that little bit superior above, the common Hindu or the common whatever it may be, what kind of backlash is there, if any, against that kind of presumption? So that would be one question, and that's really the main question. But it is just worth noting that most religious reformers of note have regarded themselves as superior in their particular theology, thinking that the orthodoxy they're railing against is somehow misconceived compared with the position which they believe has to be the truth. So that was just a thought to put to you, but I do want to thank you for your presentation, for your book, and actually for those kind remarks you made about odd things I have written.
Thank you so much. So yes, I mean these two questions are actually very significant in my own thinking about science. So the first question, let me answer in a particular manner, where in a place like India specifically, of course, I'm just using India as an example, where there's a thin line actually between the state and religion in its practice. Of course, in the text, there is a difference because it is a secular state, but in the practice, it is not always the case. Now, what happens is, even the state is always looking for this kind of a scientified religious identity, that it is the state is essentially practicing a scientific religion. And this is very clear from the work of Banu Subramaniam, the scholar that I have just mentioned. She's a feminist STA scholar, where she wrote this fantastic book, the Holy Science, the Biopolitics of Hindu Nationalism, where she tries to argue how the state is trying to argue, using some of the earlier examples, that ancient Indian tradition has invented everything that is great in science, right? Including plastic surgery, different kinds of things when you find, right? So there is already a certain form of legitimacy and sanction that is coming from the state, that it is okay to really kind of scientify religious practices of the dominant, right? Now, when it comes to the scientists, of course, they would never associate their identity with them, because again, they make a distinction because they are not politicians, they're scientists, right? But clearly, there is a conversation between what the state wants and what the scientist actually wants, right? So on the one hand, the state is trying to argue that Hinduism, for example, is a scientific religion, and they always go back to what, for example, Banu Subramaniam uses a wonderful word, wonderful phrase. She uses the word the archaic modernities, looking for the present in the past. And this is very interesting. When I was speaking to my own scientists, some of them would also then go back to the past and no, but we had great traditional mathematics. We have invented this. We have, obviously, there is a great contribution of India to the world of natural sciences, etc. But very often when they speak about it, they are not necessarily talking about what in the book I make a distinction between history of science and nostalgia for science. And this nostalgia for science is what really shapes both the state and the sciences, actually, unfortunately, in India, right? So there is no question of, so therefore the scientists need not to worry when they say that, well, we practice a scientific religion, because they do get legitimacy from the state for that reason, right? So there's a conversation between, therefore, the state and the science in many ways, actually. So yeah. So that's the first question, that the way I wanted to answer. Now, the second question was about this. What was the second question? I'm sorry, I've just lost the.
Oh, I was just drawing a certain parallel between that sense of superiority among scientists who were also believers, and what one finds with other groups of religious reformers who see their theology as, in some critical sense, superior, and the consequence for them, because perceptions of their position can often be such that they get censured, or there are so many examples frequently used when looking at science and religion, particularly within the Roman Catholic Christian tradition, where the church could come down very heavily against those who put themselves forward rather than accepting the authority of the church.
Yeah, so there are two points that I want to make here. That if we look at actually the 19th century debates on science and religion in Indian context, in fact, it's very interesting. Scholars have looked at, like, Brown, Mackenzie Brown, and a few other scholars have looked at this question from 19th century and early 20th century, where they try to actually demonstrate the ways in which the reformers, especially of Bengal, because that's where the British capital was, right? That to show that, the Indians or the Hinduism did not have actually any conflict with, in fact, the theory of evolution, right? So this is how they argued. And the rationale that they give is very interesting. The rationale is because, we are a scientific people. And it's interesting how historians then read this kind of behavior. They said it's kind of an anti-colonial thing to say that, we are not a people without science. We too have science. And they're always looking for this science. So Gyan Prakash and various other historians have looked at this particular phenomenon of how the social reformers of 19th and 20th century were trying to do exactly the same that you have just mentioned. That we did have science, and ours is a scientific culture, scientific civilization, etc. And that, of course, had sanctions from the, the higher authorities for sure. So in many ways, what they were doing was read as an anti-colonial thing. To say that, it's not that only you have science, but we also have science. Look at our texts, etc., etc. So that's the way in which how they negotiated their, existence of science, lack of science. Very interestingly, some of the reformers of colonial India, like I'm thinking about the figure called Aurobindo, who later would become actually a very revered Hindu saint, actually had argued that, the real faith is not Trinity, but it is unitary. He, in fact, actually started a church in Calcutta, the Unitary Church, to say that this is the real church. It's not Trinity, right? So you can see that, and people like Aurobindo are really trained in philosophy and science, etc. So they were trying to develop certain kind of discourse actually there. That, of course, in the contemporary times, one cannot really refer, because these same ideas are now used by the dominant sections to talk about the greatness, to talk about the supremacy, to talk about, the scientificity of the religion and the section that they come from.
Thank you.
Thank you, Renny, and thank you so much, John. And that unless we've got any sort of last minute quick questions, we've got 2 minutes left of our time with Renny. So anyone's got any quick questions? If not, thank you so much, Renny. It's been great to actually really have the chance to really discuss it with you. I think others agree with me and not really kind of unpick some of these issues, and I will definitely be buying your book later. I'm absolutely fascinated to read it. So thank you so much for your time. I'll give you another virtual round of applause. So thank you very much.